when we ever do a tour with Roth in the future.
Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen, two guitar legends who changed rock forever. But did they ever really see eye to eye? For decades, there were rumors about rivalry, admiration, and a strange silence between these two men. Before his death, Eddie revealed something shocking about Jimmy Page. But what Page later confessed about Eddie after his passing has left everyone stunned. What did the legendary Jimmy Page say about Eddie? You'd be shocked to find out what really happens behind the scenes in the rock industry. Eddie Van Halen's journey to fame. There are some moments in rock history that fans spend years waiting for. And then, out of nowhere, it finally happens. Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen are two legends who changed the sound of the guitar forever, but most people don't know how they truly felt about each other. To understand why Jimmy Page's words matter so much, we need to rewind back to the early days when Eddie's story began. Eddie was born in Amsterdam in 1955. His family didn't have much, and when they packed up and moved to America, they were chasing the same dreams so many others were chasing. His father, Jan Van Halen, was a professional musician, a jazz pianist and clarinet player. But life in America wasn't easy. When the Van Halens arrived in California, they barely spoke English. Eddie and his older brother, Alex, were thrown into a world that didn't understand them and didn't always want to. The kids at school teased them for their broken accents and homemade lunches. And because their mother was Indonesian, they faced racism at a time when being different could make you a target. Those early years were hard. But while school was a nightmare, music quickly became Eddie's escape. His father made sure both boys learned classical piano. And for a while, that's what Eddie did. He did not just play, he won contests. The judges were impressed with his ear for music. But what they didn't know was that Eddie couldn't actually read sheet music. He had learned everything by sound. That gift would follow him for the rest of his life. And while he didn't love the piano, he respected it because it taught him discipline and melody. But eventually, something else pulled his attention, and it was the guitar. At first, Eddie played the drums, and his brother, Alex, had a guitar. But after coming home one day and hearing Alex absolutely nail a drum solo, Eddie knew they had to switch. So, he gave Alex the drums and picked up the guitar. From that moment on, everything changed. Eddie learned how to play the guitar in a way most people couldn't. He didn't take lessons. He didn't follow the rules. He just practiced obsessively. He would lock himself in his room for hours, sometimes with his guitar and some soda, and play until his fingers hurt. He was always tinkering with the strings, adjusting the sound, and trying out new techniques. But he wasn't trying to copy anyone, he was just trying to invent his own way to play. In the early 70s, Eddie and Alex started a band. It was just local gigs at first, like high school dances and backyard parties. They called themselves Mammoth, but when they found out that another band already had the name, they changed it to something more personal. And that's how the name Van Halen came about. They brought in David Lee Roth as their frontman and Michael Anthony on bass, and that lineup would become legendary. At their shows, word started to spread about how good they were. People described them as a band who could play loud and fast, with a guitar player doing things no one had heard before. Eddie wasn't just playing solos, he was tearing through them with two hands, making it look effortless. In fact, some people didn't even understand what they were seeing, and they thought there were two guitarists on stage. However, it was just Eddie doing something entirely new. The real turning point came when Gene Simmons from Kiss heard them play and offered to help them record a demo. Although it didn't lead to a record deal, it gave them confidence. Then, in 1977, they finally signed with Warner Bros. Records. 1 year later, their debut album, Van Halen, dropped, and the rock world never looked the same again. That first album was packed with energy. It had several hit songs, But the track that changed everything was just a short instrumental called Eruption. It wasn't even meant to be on the album. Eddie had just been messing around during a warm-up, and the producer insisted they include it. That solo, which was barely 2 minutes long, shook the entire music world. Suddenly, every young guitarist wanted to know how to play like Eddie Van Halen. Eddie's two-handed tapping technique was groundbreaking. He wasn't the first to ever use it, but he was the first to make it explode in mainstream rock. The way he used it wasn't just for show. It was melodic, controlled, and fast. It was like classical piano technique brought over to the electric guitar. Combined with his use of harmonics, volume swells, and his homemade Frankenstrat guitar, Eddie created a signature sound that was impossible to miss. By the early 1980s, Van Halen was one of the biggest rock bands in the world. They sold out arenas, topped charts, and defined a generation of hard rock. But even at the height of their fame, Eddie never really chased the spotlight. And as much as fans loved watching him on stage, there was always a part of him that stayed totally hidden. Because behind every guitar, God is a real person. And even someone as untouchable as Eddie Van Halen had battles he didn't always talk about. The personal struggles behind the spotlight. On stage, Eddie Van Halen looked unstoppable at her. Every solo felt like a celebration, and every riff came with a smile. But away from the lights, Eddie's life was anything but perfect. Behind the scenes was a man who was fighting battles most people never saw. The challenge that hit his body the hardest was his health. For years, Eddie quietly suffered through something that would bring most people to their knees. It started with his hip. Decades of jumping, running, twisting, and spinning on stage had taken a serious toll. Eventually, the pain got worse. Walking became difficult. Performing felt like punishment. And so, in 1999, he finally went under the knife for a full hip replacement. Most fans didn't even know it had happened, because Eddie wasn't the kind of person to seek public sympathy. But that was only the beginning of his health challenges. In 2000, Eddie was hit with the devastating news that he had cancer. At first, it was just a small sore on his tongue, but tests later revealed it was throat cancer, and it was really serious. He immediately began treatment and underwent surgery, where he lost part of his tongue. For a while, it looked like he had beaten it, but cancer has a cruel way of coming back. Years later, doctors found that the cancer had spread to his lungs and then to his brain. Although Eddie didn't stop showing up or playing, behind the scenes, he was going through a slow and painful fight that wore him down over time. While his body was under attack, so was his peace of mind, because Eddie's struggles weren't only physical. He also battled with addiction, and it started the way it does for many artists. Eddie found himself under intense pressure to perform, to stay on top, to silence the critics, and to numb the pain. Unfortunately, alcohol became his coping tool, and illicit substances became a part of his daily routine. Soon, what began as a way to take the edge off slowly turned into something heavier that he couldn't control. Eddie later admitted that his drinking got worse over time and that it deeply affected his relationships, both in the band and at home. In fact, insider reports revealed that when Eddie drank, he became a completely different person. His behavior would shift and arguments would start. Unfortunately, this tension carried into his work life, with some band members finding it harder to collaborate with him during his lowest points. Still, Eddie wasn't blind to his problem. In 2007, he entered rehab, and for a while, he stayed sober. His son Wolfgang later confirmed that Eddie tried hard in those last years to clean up, stay healthy, and focus on family. It wasn't a perfect road, but it was clear that Eddie made the effort to fight back against his demons, just like he did with his health. But perhaps the most painful battlefield of all was inside his home. In 1981, Eddie married actress Valerie Bertinelli. On the surface, they were one of the most famous celebrity couples in America. Their marriage looked like a rock and roll fairy tale. But privately, things were more complicated. Valerie later opened up about their life together, saying that while there was love, there was also a lot of pain. She said Eddie's addiction, his mood swings, and the stress of fame all took a toll on their marriage. Valerie admitted that she struggled too, often enabling his habits and covering for him. They had their son Wolfgang in 1991, which brought some joy and stability for a while. But over time, the cracks widened. They officially separated in 2001 and divorced in 2007. Still, despite all the struggles, they remained on good terms. When Eddie became seriously ill in his later years, Valerie and Wolfgang were right by his side. She even said that she and Eddie told each other, "I love you," shortly before he passed. Their relationship may not have survived the storms of life, but their bond never completely broke. Through all of his struggles, Eddie still kept playing music. He showed up for the fans, built guitars, experimented with sounds, and pushed rock music in new directions. But for all the pain he endured in private, not everything stayed hidden. Eddie Van Halen had his fair share of controversies, and they weren't always pretty. Despite being a musical genius, he was also unpredictable, misunderstood, and sometimes messy. Eddie's controversies and feuds with rock legends. Eddie Van Halen was known for his groundbreaking guitar skills and his influence on modern rock music. But he also had a history of feuds, fallouts, and creative disagreements that sometimes turned into public controversies. These weren't just backstage arguments or private disagreements. Many of them shaped the way fans saw him and divided opinions even within the rock world. Perhaps the most talked about clash of Eddie's entire career is his feud with David Lee Roth, the original frontman of Van Halen. When the band first broke through in the late 1970s, Eddie and Roth were seen as the perfect creative pair. Eddie brought the sound, and Roth brought the showmanship. But as the band got bigger, cracks started to show. According to interviews with both of them over the years, they didn't agree on the band's creative direction. Roth liked big personalities, wild stage presence, and humor. Eddie wanted more control over the music and preferred a more serious and structured approach. Their disagreements became more frequent, and by 1985, the tension had gotten so bad that Roth left the band. Officially, it was framed as a mutual decision. But years later, Eddie admitted that their personalities clashed constantly. Roth, on the other hand, often hinted that Eddie wanted to take the band in a direction that didn't align with what Van Halen had started as. This departure shocked fans, and even after multiple reunion attempts, the chemistry between the two never fully recovered. Though they would reunite for tours decades later, the relationship remained strained and awkward. After Roth left, the band brought in Sammy Hagar, which led to another major chapter in Van Halen's story and another dramatic fallout. At first, things with Hagar were smooth. The band continued releasing hit albums, and they were still selling out arenas. But over time, the same pattern started to appear. Creative tensions, personality differences, and private frustrations began to rise. By the mid-1990s, the relationship between Eddie and Sammy had completely broken down. Hagar later said in interviews that things behind the scenes had become miserable and that he and Eddie were no longer communicating in a healthy way. Eddie, for his part, often remained quiet publicly but hinted at his disappointment in how things ended. Their fallout became official in 1996 when Hagar left the band, or, depending on whose version you believe, was pushed out. Years later, they reunited briefly, but even then, their relationship remained tense. In Hagar's 2011 book about his uncensored life in rock, he described Eddie's behavior during that reunion tour as erratic and concerning, even suggesting that Eddie's health and personal issues had affected his conduct. But Eddie's fallouts weren't limited to just singers. One of the most painful splits came with the band's original bassist, Michael Anthony. Anthony had been a key part of the Van Halen sound from the very beginning, not just on bass, but also providing the high harmonies that became part of the band's signature sound. Yet, by the mid-2000s, he was suddenly out of the band and replaced by Eddie's son, Wolfgang Van Halen. Fans were confused and upset. Michael had been loyal to the group for decades. Why was he being pushed aside now? Eddie later said publicly that Anthony hadn't stayed in touch and hadn't been involved in band decisions for years. But Anthony fired back, saying he had always been ready to participate and that he was deeply hurt by how things were handled. He also said he only found out he was being replaced through news reports, not from a personal conversation. The fallout caused a major divide in the fan base. Some supported Eddie's decision to bring in Wolfgang, seeing it as a father-son moment in music history. Others saw it as a betrayal of one of the band's founding members. To make things more complicated, Anthony was later edited out of promotional materials for past albums, a move that many saw as a sign that Eddie wanted to erase or downplay his contributions. And while all of these internal band feuds made headlines, Eddie also made news for his opinions on other guitarists in the industry. Though he didn't often start public fights, he was known for speaking honestly and sometimes bluntly when asked about other musicians. One of the most controversial moments came in a 2015 interview with Billboard, where Eddie gave his controversial opinion on Michael Anthony's playing ability. He said, "Every note Mike ever played, I had to show him how to play. Before we'd go on tour, he'd come over with a video camera, and I'd have to show him how to play all the parts." That statement caused an uproar. Many fans and musicians jumped to Anthony's defense, saying he had always been a reliable player and deserved more respect. There were also times when Eddie made sharp remarks about other guitarists. In an earlier interview, he spoke about how some players rely too much on distortion or gimmicks. While he didn't always name names, some felt his comments were aimed at a certain generation of guitarists who came after him. And in rare moments, he also openly expressed frustration with how guitar playing was being taught or discussed in modern rock. Even though Eddie never saw himself as someone who liked drama or controversy, his honesty and high standards often led him into conflicts, especially when he felt someone wasn't giving their best or respecting the music. Many of the feuds he was involved with stemmed from his deep commitment to the sound he had built and the legacy he wanted to protect. Despite all the disagreements and breakups, Eddie's influence never faded. His former bandmates may have argued with him, but none ever denied that his guitar work had changed their lives and the entire landscape of music. Although some of these relationships healed over time, others never did. But one of the most intriguing dynamics in Eddie's career was his relationship with Jimmy Page, the iconic guitarist from Led Zeppelin. While both were seen as guitar giants in their own right, what Eddie once said about Page left many fans divided and wondering what Page really thought in return. What Eddie's thought of Jimmy Page. Eddie Van Halen respected Jimmy Page. He always said that. But his thoughts on Page were a bit more complicated than just respect. He admired what Page did in the studio, but when it came to Page's live performances, Eddie had a very different opinion. Eddie was never shy about giving credit where it was due. In an interview, he once said that he thought Jimmy Page's work in the studio was brilliant. He specifically admired how Page layered guitar tracks and created a full, rich sound in Led Zeppelin's recordings. Eddie knew how hard it was to do that well, and he respected Page's ability to build songs with texture and depth. Page was one of the first guitarists to treat the studio like an instrument. He used effects, mic placements, and unusual techniques to make Led Zeppelin sound bigger and more dramatic. To Eddie, this wasn't just talent, it was innovation. And as someone who also pushed boundaries in the studio, Eddie connected with that. But what he said about Page's live shows definitely surprised a lot of people. In an interview, Eddie said bluntly that Jimmy Page was sloppy when playing live. He didn't mean it as a full insult, but he didn't sugarcoat it either. You see, Eddie was incredibly focused on precision. He practiced for hours every day. He built his own guitars and amps just to get the perfect sound. So when he watched Page perform live, especially in long improvisational solos, he felt it lacked a certain sharpness. His exact words were, "As a player, he's very good in the studio, but I've never seen him play well live. He's sloppy. He plays like he's got a broken hand and he's 2 years old. If you put out a good album and play like a 2-year-old, what's the purpose?" But to some music insiders, Eddie's comments didn't exactly mean he dismissed Page entirely. In fact, to some, the way he spoke about him showed a kind of frustrated admiration. He knew how good Page could be. He just didn't like that he wasn't always consistent in concerts. Still, calling out a legend like Jimmy Page took guts, and Eddie didn't seem to care. He never followed the rules of how a guitar hero was supposed to talk. However, whether or not Eddie wanted to admit it, many people believe that Jimmy Page actually helped shape some of his most famous guitar techniques. One of those techniques was tapping, which involves using both hands on the fretboard to play fast, smooth runs. While Eddie popularized tapping and made it famous with his 1978 solo Eruption, he wasn't the first person to ever do it. And Jimmy Page had done some basic tapping years earlier, like in the song Heartbreaker. Eddie always insisted that he developed tapping on his own. He said he didn't copy anyone and that he just started doing it because it sounded cool. But fans and critics have often pointed out the similarities. And even if he didn't borrow directly from Page, it's very likely that hearing those early Zeppelin solos inspired Eddie to explore what was possible on the guitar. Eddie did mention that Page's riff in Whole Lotta Love made a big impression on him when he was younger. The raw power of that song showed Eddie how much emotion and energy a guitar could carry. And so, while some fans thought Eddie was being unfair, others saw it as a guitarist simply holding another to a high standard. Either way, it revealed a lot about how Eddie thought. He wasn't impressed by names or reputations. He cared about the work itself, the playing, the sound, and the execution. To Eddie, greatness wasn't just about being legendary. It was about being sharp every single night. And that's what made him such a perfectionist and such a game-changer in rock music. When Eddie Van Halen talked about Jimmy Page, you could hear two things at once: respect and frustration. He knew Page was a giant, but he also expected giants to live up to their status every time they picked up a guitar. But what did Jimmy Page think of Eddie? For years, no one really knew what Jimmy Page thought of Eddie Van Halen. But when he finally broke his silence, after Eddie's tragic passing, what he said took everyone by surprise. Jimmy Page breaks his silence on Eddie Van Halen. For years, Jimmy Page rarely spoke about Eddie Van Halen. While fans debated their skills, styles, and legacies, Page stayed noticeably silent. Unlike many other rock legends who openly praised Eddie's guitar innovations or shared memories, Page didn't give interviews where he talked about Van Halen's impact. This silence led many fans to wonder if there was something more behind it. But that changed after Eddie tragically passed away in 2020 after a long battle with cancer. Suddenly, Jimmy Page broke his silence and said something that gave the world a clearer picture of how he truly felt. In October 2020, just days after Eddie's death, Page posted a tribute on his official Instagram account. He didn't say much. but his words were carefully chosen and meaningful. He called Eddie the real deal and praised him for his originality and style. In Page's words, "It is with great sadness that I heard the passing of Eddie Van Halen. He was the real deal. He pioneered a dazzling technique on guitar with taste and panache that I felt always placed him above his imitators." This was the first and only time Page made a strong public statement about Eddie, and it spoke volumes. By calling Eddie the real deal, Page acknowledged that Eddie's style wasn't just flashy. It had substance, precision, and heart. His statement also showed that Page didn't just see Eddie as a technical player. He respected his ability to combine speed and skill with musical personality and charm. But Page pointed out something that fans had been saying for decades. He confirmed the fact that Eddie wasn't just good. He changed the way guitarists played forever, and everyone who tried to copy him never quite matched what he had. Coming from a guitarist as influential as Jimmy Page, this was serious recognition. Page saw Eddie not just as a great player, but as someone who pushed the instrument forward. Page himself had done that with Led Zeppelin in the 70s, combining blues, hard rock, and experimental sounds. Eddie took things even further in the late 70s and 80s, using techniques like two-handed tapping, dive bombs, and harmonics that shaped a whole new era of rock. The timing of Page's tribute made it even more powerful. He didn't speak in interviews or give a long statement to the press. He kept it short and direct, and that added sincerity to the moment. Still, fans couldn't help but wonder why Page stayed silent for so long. Why didn't he ever speak about Eddie in the decades before his passing? Well, there are no clear answers. However, Jimmy Page is known for being private, and over the years, he has rarely commented on other guitarists. He hasn't been part of many public rivalries, and he tends to avoid music industry gossip. That could explain why he never joined in the frequent public praise Eddie received from others like Brian May, Steve Vai, or Joe Satriani. Another possibility is that Page may have felt Eddie's work spoke for itself, and that comparing guitarists across generations doesn't always make sense. They came from different backgrounds and eras. Page built his sound in the late 60s and early 70s, working with analog gear and raw, blues-based riffs. Eddie exploded onto the scene in the late 70s with a louder, faster, more technical approach, using modern gear and a custom-built guitar. Their styles were different, but both were equally important in the story of rock music. There's also the fact that Page and Eddie never really crossed paths publicly. There are no known collaborations between them, and no major events where they shared the stage. That mystery made Page's tribute even more important, because it confirmed that even without a personal connection, there was mutual respect. Looking back, Page's words after Eddie's death helped close a chapter that had been left open for too long. It gave fans a rare and valuable piece of insight into what one legend thought of another. And it reminded everyone that behind the silence, there was admiration. In the end, both Eddie Van Halen and Jimmy Page changed the electric guitar forever, just in different ways. Page brought texture, power, and dark beauty to his riffs. Eddie brought speed, joy, and new techniques no one had seen before. They didn't have to say much about each other, because their playing did most of the talking. So when Page finally did speak, he didn't focus on himself. He gave Eddie his moment, and in doing so, he helped bring two legacies together. Who's your favorite, Jimmy Page or Eddie Van Halen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.